Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Carrot Podcast, where we talk to the people building the green economy so we can understand where we are in the transition and what will help us get there faster. Today, we're diving into composting, a process that magically transforms biowaste, such as food scraps, yard trimmings, and organic leftovers, into something valuable, a living material that can rebuild soils, reduce pollution, and prevent methane from being released into the atmosphere. But that magic doesn't happen automatically. It depends on design, how cities collect organics, how contamination is prevented, how facilities operate, and whether compost is trusted and used at scale. To help us understand this critically important solution, we're joined by Enzo Favoino. Enzo Favoino is a leading European voice on zero waste and organics system design. He's an agronomist with more than 30 years of experience working on waste management policy and real-world system implementation. He serves as a lead scientist at Zero Waste Europe, is a co-founder of the European Compost Network, and is a technical expert and researcher on composting and sustainable waste management at the Scuola Agraria del Parco di Monza. And he's also a swimmer and Italian team captain competing in ice swimming competitions. Enzo, welcome. It's really great having you here.
My pleasure.
And I want to start with this thing about you doing swimming, ice swimming. I mean, have you defrosted yet? I know you competed last week.
Yeah, no, last week actually we were busy at the European Championship. The Italian team was the largest one because Italy was the host country this one year. So we had 55 swimmers or so in the water, in icy waters. Great results, but above all, great atmosphere. Since as with every extreme kind of sport, there's so much mutual support among swimmers, because getting at the end of your swim is already by itself an achievement.
Totally amazing. And you like suffering, obviously, which is also really funny because we're talking about I'm joking. We're talking about today we're going to be talking about a subject that is so important, yet so difficult, at least historically, to get us off the ground, that it feels like we have a major challenge before us, but it's inspiring to hear from you. And you're working on this matter every single day. So excited to jump in, Enzo. And you're an expert in composting and the work that Europe is being done in Europe for composting in general. Could you explain to the average person who isn't living this every day, what is composting and what the alternatives are, and why this is so important?
Well, basically, composting is turning organic matter, and in particular organic waste, since we are discussing today composting in the realm of waste management, sustainable waste management, or circular economy and bioeconomy. Basically, it turns it into a fertilizer. It's more precisely a soil improver, improving organic fertility of soils and thereby making soils more resilient against floods, erosion, landslides, pollution, whatever. By doing that, we are also locking carbon up in soils, which goes under the name of carbon sequestration, and thereby we may contribute to the global fight on climate change.
So in addition to preventing that organic waste ends up in a landfill, which then would be producing the methane, it's also sinking carbon. How does that sinking carbon work?
Well, first of all, let me bring up the fact that maybe it's a little bit neglected, the fact that soils are the second largest pool of carbon in the planet after the oceans. So while we are, striving daily in order to reduce by tiny, tiny concentrations the carbon dioxide which is in the atmosphere, we do not have to forget about the possibility to store more carbon in soils where it does not produce climate change. It triggers fertility, global fertility of our soils, making them more resilient, as I was discussing a while ago. So basically, whenever you use organic fertilizers, and above all, those fertilizers which are more stabilized, have already undergone transformation, and therefore organic matter has been made into more complex organic compounds, they get more resilient to further degradation. And so for quite a long time, most of the carbon will be retained in soils, and thereby, besides triggering fertility of soils, it also in the total equation of carbon will basically produce an effect whereby we will have less carbon in the atmosphere and more carbon in the soil. So that's it. That's basically it.
And it's funny. I mean, does the process of composting? Because often I've been asked this before: is composting a natural process, or is it really something more?
It is a natural process, undergoes natural degradation. We only have to speed up processes which are natural. It's microbial degradation. Well, there are some variants of composting with worms and something like that, but most of the job is being done by microbes. Microbial strains, actinomycetes, bacteria, fungi, and something like that. So through engineered composting, we are only trying to create the most favorable conditions for such a transformation to happen as quick as possible. So we reduce the footprint of the composting sites and we increase the transformation rate of waste, organic waste, that we want to make into organic fertilizers. But basically, it is a natural process. So, microbial degradation, microbial decay of organic matter would happen anyway in nature. But if you leave, organic waste here and there across the world, or you put it into a landfill, instead of producing compost, you would release some methane from landfills. Whereas if you have got a composting site, you have got a well-managed composting system whereby you do not produce methane. You tend to release a certain part of carbon dioxide, but that's biogenic carbon dioxide. And therefore, it's classified as climate neutral because it's carbon which was fixed through the photosynthesis. So basically, we are giving back the same carbon which was fixed through the photosynthesis. And so it's no net increase of global warming. But most of the carbon is retained into the final product, which is compost, and which we may use in order to increase, enhance, maximize fertility of soils and to sequester carbon in our soils.
Yeah, which is really a beautiful nature-based solution, right? I mean, we're talking about people and businesses putting together this infrastructure that's going to create optimal conditions for those microbes to work, right? What are the conditions that you need for these microbes to be able to work in their optimal fashion?
Well, first and foremost, we need organic waste. But if you miss some organic waste, we may provide some for you as well. There's plenty of organic waste, let alone in the low and middle income countries. The percentage of organic waste is there. Actually, the specific production of organic waste per person tends to be rather similar across the world in kilograms per person. But the percentage tends to be higher in the low and middle income countries because there's less packaging waste, less electronic waste, less construction and demolition waste there. And so the percentage of organic waste tends to be emphasized in this respect. But first and foremost, we need organic waste. Then we need nitrogen. Nitrogen is included in organic waste itself. So one important rule of well-managed composting is to blend materials, those with a high carbon to nitrogen ratio and those with a low carbon to nitrogen ratio. So carbon-rich materials with nitrogen-rich materials, because carbon provides energy to microbes, nitrogen enables them to reproduce, so to increase in number and thereby cause a chain effect. The speed of the transformation gets increased. Then you need humidity in the materials. Typically, the starting humidity, the starting moisture of a composting mix should be already quite good on itself. But then, since the microbes tend to release biogenic heat, so the temperature of the composting heap increases, and this causes evaporation of water. So from time to time, one may need to adjust the moisture to the optimal level. And also, we need the proper temperature. Here comes one of the fundamental rules of good composting systems, because quite often people tend to forget about getting rid of excess heat. As I already told you, microbes tend to produce biogenic heat. This tends to increase the temperature of the composting mixture. But if the temperature gets above a certain level, the speed at which the process goes on tends to decrease remarkably. So we need to get rid of excess biogenic heat, and this might be done by turning the material with more simple systems or with most complex systems by blowing forced aeration inside the composting heap. By blowing through forced aeration, we both supply the oxygen and above all, get rid of excess heat. And so we can keep the thermometric levels of the heap at the optimum level.
Amazing. And when you compare that biodegradation process or the decomposition process with what happens in a landfill, what is happening in a landfill that's different than what's happening in a composting?
Very good point. That's what we want to avoid globally, because this is worth remarking. Waste management is the third largest source of man-made methane across the globe. It's after energetic production and agriculture. In Europe, since we are decarbonizing energetic production, and so the climate footprint of energetic production is becoming lower and lower, waste management has become the second largest source of man-made methane after agriculture. It's basically animal husbandry, releasing huge amounts of methane with agriculture. But when it comes to waste management, basically the production of methane is linked to anaerobic degradation of organic waste into landfills. So this is why Europe has a global, a well-defined strategy in order to try and get rid as much as possible of methane produced through landfilling of organic waste. And there are a few cornerstones, if I may, in this strategy. The first one is mandatory separate management of organic waste. As it is stipulated at Article 22 of the Waste Framework Directive, there is an obligation which has to be complied with across Europe for separate management of organic waste. I'm saying separate management, not separate collection, because this might be performed also through promotion of home composting or adoption of community composting. With home composting or community composting, you do not need separate collection of organic waste because it's people managing their own organic waste. Or in cases where home composting is not a suitable solution, such as big cities, or community composting is not a sensible solution, then you may switch to separate collection of the organics. And this is why separate collection of the organics is being widespread across Europe now. So this is the first cornerstone of the European strategy in order to minimize release of methane from landfills. Then there is another very important cornerstone, which is an obligation on pre-treatment of anything that gets landfills. Unfortunately, this is an obligation which is complied in some countries, the Nordic countries, the Central European countries, Italy. Italy is adopting a mix of options for residual waste management through a combination of incineration or mechanical biological treatment. And both of them, they basically minimize the potential production of methane of anything that gets landfilled. You may say, okay, but if we do have separate collection of the organics upfront, why do we need also treatment of the waste before landfilling? This would be a good question. Unfortunately, much as we seek perfection, and this is why I'm so committed to zero waste. Zero waste is a continued journey towards zero waste, but we target perfection, but we can live with the imperfection of the current ages, of the current times. And so we know that no separate collection system is 100% perfect. There are many schemes which get closer and closer to 100%. For instance, I live near Milan, which is the largest city worldwide, which has already covered 100% of the population with separate collection of the kitchen organics, which is the most challenging type of separate collection one may imagine for a big city like Milan, 1.4 million people, 800,000 daily commuter workers, 21 million visitors a year. But Milan is covering 100% of the households, the large producers, such as the Horeca sector, with separate collection of the organics. Well, Milan, through a well-designed scheme and a properly run scheme, is currently capturing 87% of the total organics generated by the city, which makes us very, very happy because it's a very big achievement. But still, there is a 13% of the organics which are not captured through separate collection. And so they end up in residual waste. And without pre-treatment, such a percentage of organics would produce methane once landfilled. Or you may consider also some biodegradable waste which is not suitable for composting, such as the nappies, absorbent hygiene products, because you may have zinc-based protecting creams for skin. You have plastics inside. You have got the super absorbent, which is not biodegradable. So they're not so suitable for composting, the nappies. So that being the case, you can get residual waste. You treat it with some biological pretreatment or through incineration, and then you put into the landfill a material which is not prone to producing any methane anymore. And this is extremely important in order to maximize the efficacy of the global strategies to reduce the global warming and climate change.
It's just incredible to me that we can have a city the size of Milano that has food waste programs that can reach that level of proper sorting at the source, and makes perfect sense that we have to do something about the residuals. So that makes perfect sense. But what do you see when you look at these examples like Milan? And you could bring in other examples, by the way, of other cities or municipalities. I know many are in Italy, but other situations where we're getting such high indicators. And then we look at the global South, right, that has essentially no sorting at the source and are at tremendously low levels, or even developed countries like the United States, right? We're talking many of the states have below 2% food waste sorting and capacity of treating those materials. It would be great to understand, what do you think was the great jump? I mean, what changed that made Milan the way it is today, or the municipalities in Italy or others change? What was the first step, you think?
If you mean the trigger, that's a very good question. But basically, I told you about the obligation on pretreatment of residual waste. Well, first of all, incineration is hell expensive. And the costs for incineration are skyrocketing right now because, they want to make incineration cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. One may think whether it's clean enough, but also you may have problems with lock in, stranded assets. Once you have got an incinerator, you have to feed the beast for 20 or 30 years, which goes against the principles themselves of circular economy, whereby you want to raise the bar of ambition higher and higher and higher and higher. And if you have got an incinerator in the community, this might get in the way of such ambition, of course. But this is not what we are discussing today. I just wanted to say that in brackets, to tell you that we tend to prefer biological treatment, which is more flexible, because biological treatment, is a composting-like process. It's basically the same technology. You apply biological treatment to residual waste, which is dirty organics. You stabilize them. You have them degraded into biogenic carbon dioxide, which is climate neutral, and you avoid methane, which is not climate neutral. So that's the trick through biological treatment. But since it is based on a composting-like technology, it's inherently flexible, because you may get residual waste at first when you don't have separate collection schemes implemented yet, or just in the early stages. And then while you increase and disseminate separate collection across your country, your district, your region, whatever, then you will have more and more clean organics and less dirty organics in residual waste. So you may use the very same capacity to treat more and more clean organics to make them into compost, and less and less dirty organics to reduce the methane potential before landfilling. However, the point is related to your question. What was the trigger to start such effective separate collection programs in Italy, and I would say in Europe? Since there is the obligation on pretreatment, which, from the economic standpoint, you may consider that as internalization of environmental externalities. It makes residual waste management more expensive because we want to avoid environmental externalities. But this has made management of residual waste much more expensive. In Italy, there is no single area in which you may dispose of residual waste for less than 120, 150 euros a ton. If it is incineration with the brand new incinerators, it tends to go towards 200 euros a ton and even more. And that's the typical European cost level for incineration in the near future. Also because there will be the emission trading scheme, the carbon tax on incineration soon in 2028. However, with such high costs for residual waste management, communities, are pushed to separate as much as possible, because the more you separate, the more you compost, the more you recycle, the more you reuse, the more you minimize residual waste, and so the less you pay on residual waste. So that was the trigger, basically. And this is why now in all countries across Europe, there is this common trend to implement, extend, consolidate, and disseminate separate collection systems for organics on the one hand, packaging waste, and other waste on the other hand.
Amazing. So it started with the residual waste piece, and then it moved into the biological treatment, would you say? Or is it kind of organic? Like sometimes one will begin before the other. It depends on different scenarios, would you say?
Well, the obligation on pretreatment was stipulated in the landfill directive back in 1999. So it's already 27 years ago. Whereas the obligation for separate management of organic waste was only stipulated in the Waste Framework Directive in 2018, and it's effective January the 1st, 2024, so 25 years after the obligation on pretreatment. So the key driver for proper and sustainable waste management in Europe was, to my opinion, the obligation on pretreatment, because it made residual waste management much more expensive. And so it was pushing all the decision makers, all the mayors, the deputy mayors, the ministries, to consider higher and higher levels of separate collection, just to save money. And we do have outstanding evidence that those communities with the highest separate collection levels, and it's basically those ones with the best performing schemes for composting, for separate collection of the organics. So those with the highest levels of separate collection are those ones with the least cost, which is transferred to the taxpayers when it comes to waste management. And that's very important to be emphasized.
Right. And you think so? So there is a data point that I saw recently. I think from a zero waste report. We're talking about sort of 25% organics diversion, sorting at the source. So in your view, the policy is working, and that 25% number is just a point along the trajectory, or do you think we're already hitting resistance in a major way? Yeah.
I know the number you're mentioning, because I was one of the co-authors of that report we did for Zero Waste Europe and BIC, which is the Bio-Based Industries Consortium. BIC, it's a private-public partnership mandated by the European Union to take care of bioeconomy. It's basically a network in which they discuss, they define strategies for bioeconomy. And of course, we had a converging interest between Zero Waste Europe and BIC, because both of us, we wanted to maximize captures of biowaste. So we did this survey whereby we found out that only 1/4 of kitchen waste for the moment is collected. Actually, the number is higher when it comes to biowaste as a whole. But biowaste, conflates kitchen waste and garden waste. It's much easier to collect garden waste. Basically, you just open up a municipal recycling center and you tell people, please go there and take your garden waste there. Separate collection of kitchen waste is more complex. It requires a better design of the system. And so implementation may take a longer time. So this is part of the reason why only 25% of kitchen waste is currently captured. But since we are goodwillers. We are people of good plans. We never give up a challenge and something like that. At the same time, while stressing that only 1/4 of kitchen waste is currently captured, we also emphasized the good performing situations in which such a percentage is much higher. One is the city I mentioned a while ago, which is Milan, with 87%, which is more than 3 times as much. 87% is nearly 90% of the total organics generated by the city. So if you ask me why, for the moment, the European average is that low, only 25% of kitchen waste, that's a mix of reasons. There's still a large part of countries where composting programs are in the infancy, yet in the infancy. The obligation is effective starting from January the 1st, 2024. Of course, many countries have stipulated accordingly an obligation for all the municipalities to separate organics, but then they have to check whether the municipalities are collecting or not. Sometimes they have got a grace period because the municipalities themselves, they say, I want to separate the organics, but I'm under a current contract which lasts until 2030. And if I ask my private contractor, please, can you implement separate collection of the organics? The private contractor will tell me, okay, but this is a remarkable change of the contractual conditions, and so I will make you pay much more. So whenever you have got an ongoing contract, it's not the proper time to change anything. But at the end of the current contract, well, for the new tendering procedure, you may ask all the bidders, I want the system to include separate collection of the organics. So quite often, still, there are municipalities or regions where separate collection has not been implemented yet. But we emphasized another important factor for such a low capture as an European average. I told you about the obligation stipulated by the Waste Framework Directive. But an obligation is never the best way to have a performing system. Because if you have an obligation, okay, the local decision maker, it may be the mayor, it says, okay, I will have to abide by the obligation. I will put a wheelie bin in the main square of the city. I'm complying with the obligation, and I will tell my citizens, please put your organics there. So that being the case, you are complying. Of course, I'm stretching, the way of I'm making concepts. But anyway, with such a poorly designed system, you comply with the obligation, but you do not deliver on performing results. So what we told the European Commission with the report I co-authored is the obligation is not sufficient. We also need specific legally binding targets in terms of collected biowaste, or even better, because if you say, okay, I want to maximize separate collection of biowaste, this might, clash with the promotion of home composting locally. And we know home composting is a very sustainable approach for the management of organic waste because you manage your organics in your own backyard. So whenever possible, I'm the happiest man in the world to promote home composting. But if we mandate legally binding targets in terms of, I don't know, kilograms per inhabitant and year of biowaste which has to be separately collected, this will get in the way of promotion of home composting. So what we told the European Commission was the most sensible way to define legally binding targets for biowaste management is to define a target in terms of minimize the amounts of organics inside residual waste. So you have together the contribution of food recovery programs, promotion of home composting, community composting programs, separate collection, centralized composting, and anaerobic digestion. All of them would, contribute towards minimization of organics inside residual waste. So this is our proposal, which is quite compelling. We always support it with plenty of arguments and plenty of evidence of what is achievable, what is already achieved in well-performing schemes and something like that. So it's quite likely to be taken on board in the next Circular Economy Act, which is due out in the second part of 2026.
No, I really like that because it's very in line with the zero waste goal. It's an outcomes based model, but it also leaves it very flexible for all of the different technologies, all of the different solutions that may exist in different places. And even the technologies that would be used could be at different costs at different locations, right? So that makes
Right.
just a lot of sense. And sticking to that cost
Yeah.
piece, go ahead,
Now,
go
if
ahead.
I may, just one moment to top it up. But probably those listening to this podcast, they know it already. But of course, while in big cities, separate collection plays a major role. In rural villages with sparsely populated households, it doesn't make much sense, to drive your truck to get a few kilograms of organics as far as 2 kilometers to reach a remote dwelling. That being the case, it makes much more sense to promote home composting, of course, on environmental grounds, but also on operational and economic grounds to save money.
No, absolutely. And the numbers that I have usually in the global south, we're talking about, at least 200, but up to 500% more expensive to do the biological treatment from a services perspective, right? So then it becomes very difficult to implement this. And I totally agree with you. I mean, I'm more on the incentive side of the equation, trying to figure out what are the right incentives, economic incentives also that can help introduce this more quickly at scale. And so that makes a lot of sense that it's a combination of the two. Go ahead.
If I may say something on the low-income countries and the middle-income countries, because I was a lucky man because I had the possibility to cooperate with many of them. One of the work programs I remember with most pleasure is the one we had with Cambodia. There was the brand new Minister of the Environment there, and we held the definition of the national strategy for waste management, which was basically organic waste management. In low-income countries, in many situations, there are no formal schemes for collection of waste. And so this might make it tough, very difficult to consider implementing separate collection systems for organics because it would be a net cost where they do not pay anything at the moment for waste management. But that being the case, you may consider anyway that in the low-income countries, the value itself of the end product may be very, very, very important because most of the people, they have got their own food production, they have got their own backyards and something like that. And so promoting home composting or promoting community composting, whereby there's a group of households, taking their organics to a common site and then getting the product and using it for their own purposes. So such approaches make sense right away in order to start some organics management programs. Then in the future, when they become more wealthy, they establish formal collection systems and so on and so forth, landfills become more expensive, incineration will always be expensive, the most expensive solution, and something like that, it's the opportunity cost, as the economists call it. So what you save by doing composting instead of sending it into a landfill or to an incinerator. But this will be in the future. For the moment, I think, micro scale composting does most of the job in most of the situations in the low income countries.
Amazing. And it does require education, helping people to understand, like a lot of community work, right, to get that going. I've had the fortune of working on a couple of these types of projects very closely. But when it works, it's a beautiful thing, right? I mean, even for small businesses, right? I worked on a zero waste bar and restaurant network in Brasilia, in Brazil, and once it's actually pretty amazing story. Once everybody was on board, right? They were paying considerably more to actually do the composting. But even during the pandemic, they would not stop doing the composting work because it was so important to them. It just once you flip the switch, it's done, right? You understand it. It's very hard for you to imagine going back. So yeah, a lot of potential there. And Yannick, very recently, this Zero Waste Europe launched a EPR program, a policy recommendation, right, for an EPR for food waste. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because what EPR, I'll let you talk about it.
Sure. Yeah, this is brand new. It was launched a couple of weeks ago as a formal proposal to the European institutions. They are now considering it. They consider whatever comes from Zero Waste Europe quite seriously, because they know we always support it with plenty of science and evidence, operational evidence, economic evidence, and something like that. So basically, the concept is we have got a long-standing history about EPR, extended producer responsibility in Europe, but it was mostly in the beginning, it was basically focused on packaging waste, which is the most easy, because you say, okay, when I go to the supermarket and buy a soda, water, wine, or chips, whatever, I do not want to buy also the packaging. Actually, I go there to buy the beverage or the chips and not the packaging. And so I want the packaging producers to put a certain fee in order to collate a certain budget and to support the efforts of local communities to do separate collection. So municipalities, they get revenues from the packaging producers for packaging waste, which is getting separately collected. Then the concept has been extended to other types of waste, such as waste electric and electronic equipment, and something like that. We said, look, organic waste is the most important chunk of our municipal solid waste, but there is no extended producer responsibility. And of course, many were telling us, yes, but nobody is responsible for the production of organic waste, because organic waste is in nature, it's inherent to producing and using food and eating food and something like that. But we said, why not proposing? We may single out what are the key points in the supply chain where this might be included, a small fee, a very small fee, in order to make a budget and to support the efforts of municipalities, not just on separate collection, centralized composting, and centralized anaerobic digestion, which will be part of the scheme, but also on promotion of home composting programs, promotion of community composting programs, and even food recovery programs. Because all of them, they contribute towards a sustainable management of food and of food waste, basically. So we found out what are the key points where this might be imposed. It's cost neutral, because at some point, the consumer, who is also a taxpayer, it's the dual nature of every individual. The consumer will have to pay slightly more, but we did calculations. It's a very slight amount. So it's very, very trivial. They will not even realize it. But on the other hand, as a taxpayer, he will benefit from the fact that his municipality or her municipality will be rewarded for the efforts on home composting, community composting, separate collection, centralized composting, centralized anaerobic digestion, and food recovery programs. So he will pay slightly more to purchase some food, but he will pay less for waste management. And so it's cost neutral, but this will constitute a near-marked budgetary appropriation to support good efforts in optimizing schemes for the management of organics. So this is a brand new proposal. Now the European institutions are considering it, because as usual, we are not zero wasters just to protest and something like that. We are always zero wasters because we want to change and improve the world one bin of waste at a time, one community at a time. This is what we always remind ourselves and we tell everybody. And so whatever comes from Zero Waste Europe, they consider that very seriously, as I already told you. We are keeping our fingers crossed whether this might be also be taken on board for the next to be published Circular Economy Act, which will fill the gaps of what is still missing in the European agenda on circular economy.
And I think such an important piece of the story is that when you actually attribute the cost to those that are benefiting financially from that product that is being produced, you're also incentivizing better management in general, not just downstream, not just after the actual company, let's say, who produced that product is going. You're actually creating the infrastructure that everybody can be benefiting from, like large infrastructure that all companies can be benefiting from. And by attributing that cost to that organization that is actually benefiting from it, you're creating the right incentives. The incentives are correctly put in place so that you can actually be taking care of that cost. So I'm really a big fan of that. I hope it goes forward, and I'll be following it very closely, Enzo, on that front. And yeah, I think it's really big. I mean, there's never been anything like that done before anywhere in the world. So,
well, actually,
oh yeah.
no, this was inspired by a move of the Greek government. The Greek government has already stipulated in a national act the introduction of an EPR scheme for food products, but it's only for the HoReCa sector. So, it still leaves aside the largest chunk of food, which it does not pass by the HoReCa sector, hotels, restaurants, and canteens. And also, it has been it's a matter of perception. It has been perceived as an additional tax on the HoReCa sector only. Whereas in our proposal, we made it broader with a bigger vision. And so we have emphasized its nature as an instrument in order to help all the local communities improve their waste management, and in particular organic waste management, which is the key to circular economy. We say organic waste management is really the key, the springboard to real circular economy, because as soon as we take organics, we capture organics efficiently, we can sharply reduce also the collection frequency for residual waste, because we have taken the organics out, and so residual waste is much less stinky, dirty, sticky, and something like that. And by reducing the collection frequency for residual waste, you have got a much bigger tendency of households also to separate packaging waste, waste electric and electronic equipment, whatever. So the separate collection rate gets boosted even in other areas apart from organic waste.
We've observed that a lot. The minute you take organics out, it unlocks the circularity of all the other resources. And I'd be interesting for Milan, once you did that jump to over 80% of food waste collection and organics, did you get those? The overall circular economy or overall recycling rates improve dramatically as well in the other waste streams? I imagine, yeah.
They did, because Milan, before rolling out a separate collection of the organics, actually, they only had a dedicated system for the HoReCa sector, for the large producers. But then when they implemented it for the households, which was in 2012, in as little as 18 months, the whole city was covered. They went on 350,000 people at a time. The city was divided into 4 quarters. So it was November 2012, and then June 2013, and then November 2013, and then June 2014. So in as little as 18 months, the whole city was covered. And before that, they were around the 32% separate collection rate. Now Milan is at 65%, which includes the contribution of our kitchen organics themselves, but kitchen organics are not 35%. Kitchen organics are 20%. Then there is the contribution of the HoReCa sector. There is the contribution of garden waste among the organics. But there was also a remarkable increase in separate collection of dry recyclables as well.
That's such a good point. It's like the sorting of food waste creates the demand for all the other organics as well, right? And you're solving problems on all sides. Yeah.
I'm telling you in numbers. Milan used to collect residual waste 3 times a week before separating the organics. And now it only collects residual waste once a week. And so people, they are pushed to separate as much plastics, paper, glass, metals, whatever, just to get rid of them, to put them at the curb during the collection day. In other communities, we have got probably what is the worldwide front runner when it comes to separate collection rates. which is Province Treviso, totaling a population of 1 million inhabitants, scattered across some 85 municipalities, and they are at 90% provincial average in separate collection, 90% the average. So there are a few municipalities at 95% there. And that's mostly thanks to optimized design of separate collection of organics. Now, in that area, they are collecting residual waste on the average 6 times a year, every other month, because they have become so effective in collecting organics that there is no need for a frequent collection of residual waste. And this, in turn, has pushed the households to separate as much as possible also the dry recyclables, just because residual waste is collected so seldom, and therefore, they separate as much as possible.
That's incredible. And I wanted now, Enzo, if we could step back and talk about the alternatives. We have, you have once the biowaste, the organic waste doesn't go to a landfill, it can go to composting, and it could go primarily also as another alternative, anaerobic digestion, right? How do you compare the two? And is there a clear front runner, or does it depend on the local situations? And how do you see the two?
It depends on the local situation. Now it's high time for anaerobic digestion in the European Union because since we are trying to decarbonize, there are very good incentives for renewable energy. And anaerobic digestion produces a huge amount of renewable energy. Per each ton of kitchen organics, you may have, depending on the technology, between 100 and 250 kilowatt hours, which is an incredible amount of renewable energy. By the way, we want to get more and more independent, or we do not want to use Russian gas anymore. That's a key strategic part of European policy right now. And a very big contribution to such independence will come also from anaerobic digestion. So in the European agenda, it's very high time for anaerobic digestion. But if I look at that from the local standpoint, if you ask me, okay, if I am a decision maker, I am a mayor, I want to implement separate collection of the organics, and then what do you recommend? Is it anaerobic digestion or is it composting? They ask me quite frequently because they acknowledge me as one of the organics experts, and I always tell them it depends. It depends on the local situation. There are pros and cons on the two. Basically, the key advantage of adopting anaerobic digestion, I already brought it up, which is production of renewable energy. So instead of losing part of the carbon as carbon dioxide, let me remind once again, it's biogenic carbon, and so it's climate neutral, but still it is lost. We cannot use it. Whereas with anaerobic digestion, we keep it in the form of renewable methane, which may replace fossil methane. And so that's a key environmental advantage, which may become also an economic advantage if there are some subsidy programs locally, which is the case in most situations across Europe. But then on the other hand, we have to consider from the standpoint of capital expenditures, anaerobic digestion tends to be much more expensive than plain composting. And therefore, it depends. Do you have granting programs locally to support infrastructure for organics, or don't you have them? You have to make a calculation, based on the granting programs, if and when they are available, and on the subsidy programs, if and when they are available. If no granting programs, if no subsidy programs, I'd go for composting. Also, composting is more scalable, typically more scalable. It may be done in your backyard. It may be done at the community level. It may be done in decentralized composting, a few hundred tons a year, whereas typically anaerobic digestion requires tens of thousands tons a year. Even though, in India, there are my friends from India, and they are adopting decentralized anaerobic digestion. It's a long-standing tradition there. They have got, handmade solutions for anaerobic digestion in their own backyard. But frankly speaking, it's more difficult to teach people to do anaerobic digestion in their backyard than to do a composting heap in their own backyard. So when it comes to this decentralization, I'd go for composting. So if you have got a community which is a front runner, it's a trailblazer in composting programs. And so you are starting in the desert and you've only got, say, 10,000 people in your community which can produce 1,000 tons a year of organics to be composted. I'd go for composting. Then, if you convince the bordering municipalities because your system is working well, then you can get together with the other municipalities. You can get your infrastructure maybe funded by the central government because you have been made into a pilot program for the whole country or something like that. So why not putting an anaerobic digester so you may have anaerobic digestion first and then composting? And this tells you something I wanted to say, the most important when it comes to anaerobic digestion and composting, and this is why I tell it in the end. We always recommend, when I say we, it's not just the zero wasters. I'm an agronomist. You said it yourself, and therefore I know the benefits of composting. With anaerobic digestion, in the end of the process, you will have methane and you will have digestates. In some countries, they already consider digestates as an organic fertilizer, so they go to direct land spreading with digestates. As an agronomist, I'm not supportive to such strategies. I'd always want digestate to be post-composted through a final aerobic step in order to be made into a compost. By doing that, you get rid of residual phytotoxicity of digestates. You bind nitrogen more tightly onto organic matter, so you do not lose nitrogen into the groundwater or as ammonia into the atmosphere, and ammonia is a precursor of nanoparticulates. So you maximize both the environmental and the agronomic benefits, and you minimize the downsides. So what we say is always, if you consider anaerobic digestion, consider combination of anaerobic digestion first, then you take your digestate and you have it composted to make it into a compost. That's the best way to deal with your organics.
That's terrific. That was a very important point, and I think that you bringing up the fact that even the digestate needs to go through that process, right? Then you're talking about the soil health, right? The importance of having having that soil health, and which then brings me to a separate question. It's kind of a theory I've been having for quite some time, where I think about the choice between the two being more about what's the end product that we need more in greater need. Is it green power on one end, or is it a nutrient or a very good soil aggregate? Is that something that you think is a good way to think about it? For example, in very fragile soil locations that have very fragile soils, maybe you would get more of an output from having better compost versus the power. Is that a good way to think about it, or do you think it just depends?
Yes, it depends. Your question makes sense, and definitely depending on different situations. For instance, in the relatively cold and wet climates as the average European weather, you know, the soils in Northern Europe, they are already well provided in organic matter. So the importance of giving organic matter back to soils tends to be lower than in Southern European countries, including Italy, where I live. So that being the case, producing more compost might make sense. And indeed, if you have got plain composting, you tend to have a higher percentage of end product relative to the input material. But that's also related to the fact that with plain composting, you tend to blend garden waste and kitchen waste. And garden waste, is more reluctant to degradation. So it tends to increase the total yield, final yield, in terms of end products. However, as I told you, with a proper combination of the two, you may have both renewable energy and a soil improver. So basically, I'd always recommend for the communities which are the trailblazers in their own country to start with plain composting, because it's more robust, it's more scalable, it takes much less capital expenditures, and so on and so forth. Then at a later stage, when maybe renewable energy becomes more important because your country has adopted the national commitments toward decarbonization, and so it has stipulated subsidy programs, and so on and so forth, then you may consider, putting an anaerobic digester to be used before the composting stage. And so you will have both. But it very much, as you were nicely saying, it very much depends on the local situations.
No, I like that. I think you did change my opinion a little bit on that, on what's optimal ultimately, because the quality of the output is actually not as let's say, it can be very good anyways, and you get the benefits as well. So
If you get digested post composted, the quality is pretty much the same. It's pretty much the same.
Okay, great. I didn't know that. Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
Enzo, like if you were to talk to a big company right now and you were to tell them, I know what you tell a municipality now, but if you were to go to a company today, and what would you be recommending to them when they think about their strategy regarding biowaste, or in general, what would be, what do you usually say to these leaders?
That's a nice motivating question. I happen to have talks with investors quite often. And I would say what I always bring up is the fact that in Europe, bankability of investments is fully secured because we do have a consistent agenda on the management of organics. So first and foremost, I tell them to monitor the policy, not just at a country level, but at a global level. And the global policy tells us that we have to take the organics out of landfills. Okay, one may say, yes, with a big incinerator, I get the problem sorted out, which is only part of the truth, because with incineration, you avoid methane from landfills, but you spew huge amounts of fossil carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which does not happen with composting, So I think there will be a growing trend towards composting worldwide, which is already acknowledged by international agencies, including the United Nations Environmental Programme, as one of the fundamental tools in order to optimize the management of waste and to minimize anthropogenic methane. And as I told you, the landfills are the third largest source of man-made methane. So I tell them to keep an eye to monitor the international policy, and when it gets translated into domestic policy at a country level. Bankability, as soon as you have got a dedicated sectoral policy, bankability is secured. If you go to a bank and you apply to get a loan, and the bank asks you, but can you secure the payback of such an investment? Well, you can show, there is an obligation for separate collection, or there are legally binding targets for minimization of organics inside residual waste. This is why, basically, we are not promoting legally binding targets or obligations primarily for communities, but to secure the bankability of investments, related investments in a given sector. And so that's the most important. Then, of course, the subsequent step for the investor would be, but which type of technology? But this hooks very well with what I told you at the previous round. So it depends. It depends on the local conditions. It depends whether there are granting programs. It depends whether there are subsidy programs. And this might guide you through the choice between plain composting and anaerobic digestion, or better worded, a combination of anaerobic digestion with a final composting stage.
Terrific. And in that regard, I mean, I think that answers everything. I mean, in general, how we should be thinking about this. Is there a new technology, or is there anything out there that you're looking at, Enzo, which kind of is making you tickle in terms of your thought process of new frontiers that are coming? Is there anything out there that we can be study about, or some more, or look at?
Yeah, I'd mention the black soldier fly. The black soldier fly, black soldier fly is a way of producing organic castings through insects. They produce both larvae, which are used as a protein feed for animals, which might be important. Producing proteins in the future will become one of the most urgent needs for mankind, for animal husbandry, and something like that. And then you have got the castings, which is an organic fertilizer. For the moment, this is not so popular in the European Union. It is very popular in Africa, in Asia, because it's a low-cost solution for small quantities. It's fairly labor-intensive. In Europe, we also tend to have problems with a specific legislation on animal byproducts, and the final end product is not codified yet as an organic fertilizer. But of course, we started getting intrigued by that because we think it's sensible to a very large extent. And so sooner or later, we will investigate deeper and deeper into that in order to have also a codified European legislation to make it possible as well.
And I think one of the great things about BSF, right, is that they say at least that it's very scalable. Would you agree with that?
It is. It is. This is what I was telling you a while ago. It's very, very scalable. It makes perfectly sense at small quantities, and this is why it's gaining momentum in many situations. In the front runners, in the piloting schemes, both in Africa and in Asia.
Wonderful. Enzo, thank you so much. This has been an amazing talk. I've spoken to you before many times, and it's always a real pleasure. I think you're carrying a big flag, a very important flag. You and your team at Zero Waste Europe, amazing work. So thank you again. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with us.
It was a pleasure.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye. Cheers.